Hey guys, so this week we're talking actually about our last topic of the semester, and that is going to be genetic testing. What's interesting about this topic, in my opinion, and the reason why I cover it is because many of you in the future are going to come in contact with different diseases and different individuals potentially that have had or have a genetic disorder or scenario that causes their physical characteristics to actually be displayed differently than what one that would not have any genetic abnormalities, in their physical being. And so, what I love about genetic mutations and talking about that is it just brings some clarity to why things happen the way that they do. We spent some time, obviously, talking about DNA. A couple weeks ago, you guys worked through some protein synthesis for me, and looking at how that DNA code will lead us to the different protein compositions and creations in the human body. Now, as I look at that and we begin to somewhat explain further what that looks like, as you created those codes, what you were ultimately giving me was a strand of proteins. Now, these strands of proteins in the human body do all sorts of things, but specifically these proteins are going to make you who you are. So the majority of your cells and the majority of who you the constituents rather of the human body are actually made of these subsets of proteins. And when you talk about proteins, from cellular composition to what makes up different transport systems inside of the cell, these proteins and how they fold and what they look like matter to functionality. In fact, when I teach this in higher level courses, what I tell students constantly is, look, a protein folding gives it its function. Okay, so we lined out different types of proteins. Those proteins, depending on what that layout looked like, would depend on how that protein would kind of fold up. That folding pattern would then determine what its function is. In my mind, it's kind of like if you've ever gotten a box of Legos, or maybe you've known somebody that has, and in that box of Legos, there's a set of instructions. Now, you can follow those instructions to create or fold that Lego the way it's supposed to be folded, or you can go off the instructions and do whatever you want. Now, the end result will be different if you don't create what is asked by the instructions. Okay, it's supposed to be a car, but with Legos that you could also form an airplane, or you can also form, a train, or whatever it is you want to form at that point in time. And so proteins are the building blocks. Proteins, the things that we created through our protein synthesis, these are the things that make us up. However, how they fold will change their pattern. And so when you look at genetic mutation, or you look at issues of genetics, there's going to be four main things that will happen with that DNA code. The first thing that may happen is that of substitution. When I look at substitution, that means one of my letters actually changed. So somewhere my DNA didn't come in and get translated the correct way. And so now I have a different letter in there. Now, if I have a different letter in there, it's going to signal for me a different protein. I want you to be aware of the fact that one single protein that's not in there correctly can cause a whole entire different protein folding pattern, therefore a whole entire different function. The second thing that could happen is that of an insertion. An insertion is where I now have an extra base. I have an extra letter that got put in there on accident. Instead of just having 3, I had 4. Well, that changes everything at that point in time to give me a whole different folding pattern. The third one is that of a deletion. These are a little bit more common because what happens is just the DNA code gets deleted. So for whatever reason, toxins, different issues down the line, sunlight even could cause just letters to be deleted. And as DNA letters get deleted, then it's going to shift everything down. And now what I have is created a protein that doesn't look like it's supposed to look. Once again, if it doesn't look like it's supposed to look, it's not going to fold the way it's supposed to. If it doesn't fold the way it's supposed to, it doesn't have a function like it's supposed to. The last one is going to be that of a frame shift. What's interesting about a frame shift is it's kind of a unique scenario. So if I had A, B, C, D as my letters, what would happen then? Somewhere, let's just say a C gets inserted between A and B. So now it's A, C, B, C, D, F, or whatever. And at that point, then everything shifts down. And so that extra base causes the whole entire base systematics necessarily to then shift. And so then you get a whole different protein reading as well. Really, with a frame shift, which those are the most severe, all of your proteins after that would look different. So it's not where just one would look different. Now every single one looks different because everything's been shifted down a letter. And so very, very unique in what they are, but really, guys, genetic mutations are really caused by little simple things like a toxin that would come in and change the DNA code, or sunlight, which is a big one. I think of cancer in general. Cancers are oftentimes given by just one single mutation that causes an uproar of different scenarios that an individual then cannot function the way that they're supposed to. And so these genetic mutations, which are interesting, and can actually be detected now by what we call a genetic scan. These genetic scans would allow you the ability to look at your DNA and see whether or not you carry certain genes for certain disorders down the line. A couple of them, breast cancer, which is huge. We found out breast cancer, which is one of the most common in females after heart disease. Breast cancer is carried by what we call a BRCA gene, BRCA, and we can scan ladies now to see if they carry that gene. If they carry that gene, then there's a higher prevalence in that they will actually succumb to breast cancer at some point in their life. Other things like Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a disease where usually hits or strikes about the age of 40, where then your muscles don't function the way that they're supposed to because of protein malfunction. And so what occurs is eventually death and paralysis comes by that, because breathing and functionality is all given to you by muscles. And so when you remove that ability, because these individuals are experiencing now this genetic disorder, that kind of shuts the life down. So I think for me, one of the biggest questions that I had in doing studies and getting my master's degree and things like that is, these things are very ethical, right? So do you have a right? Do you feel, that going in and getting a genetic test done to see, do I carry the gene for this or do I carry the gene for that? Is that something that you want to do? For me, I've kind of thrown it around back and forth. I do know that it's possible, to go in and test those things. The big question is, what would happen if you did? If you did have that. The reality is, just to let you know, that if you do have that, let's just say breast cancer gene, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get it. It just means you carry the gene. So there's a chance you could get it. And many people make themselves crazy, I think, by knowing too many details. I think many of you potentially are hypochondriacs, right? You're on WebMD and you find out you're dying because you have, XYZ symptoms. And it's funny what we do to ourselves because we do that. But the reality is, these genetic scans, even though they may tell you all the things that could go wrong, doesn't necessarily mean that they actually will, and so I've always been kind of an advocate of, don't do it if you don't have to do it, because I'd rather just trust God right in the middle of it, and instead of having to worry about, man, I know too much. At some point in my future, this is going to hit me and I'm going to be done. Still live your life to the best you can, work every day the best you can in the kingdom, etc. But I do think there's a boundary line somewhere, and many of you may have differing opinions, and that's totally fine. Many of you maybe want to know. We're pregnant, and so when I went in to the doctor recently, they asked, what tests do I want to have done? Do I want to know if this baby has, Down syndrome, or do I want to know if this baby has any type of genetic abnormality? Because if it does, they could take precautions. Well, for me, obviously, I'm not going to abort this baby, regardless of what it is or what it looks like. I trust God and all of that. But she said, there's people that would. But I asked her, I said, there's no way I would ever abort a child. And she said, well, sometimes people will do it just to have the precautions so they can prepare themselves mentally. And maybe you're one of those people who you need to know, and that's fine if you do. You have the ability by genetic testing today to determine that. Designer babies is coming into play at this point, where you can actually choose genetically, whether or not you want blonde hair, blue-eyed babies, certain heights, etc. You can actually choose that now. It hasn't been released as far as something they've actually allowed people to do, but it is a possibility, and they call it, this whole designer baby idea. Is that ethical? Well, a lot of people would say, no, absolutely not. You're playing God at that point. But because of genetic testing, we're able to do that. We can play around with certain genes and create these things. And it's a little scary at some point. Cloning is also another big one. Cloning now is where we're taking these genetic DNA assessments and creating then from that these new species that are actually identical to the parent one. And so we haven't done that with humans yet. There's rumors that that's going on, but it's not true from what I understand scientifically. We've done this with animals though, and so that's just a unique kind of scenario. Once again, a lot of issues. Some people really have major opinions about it, and that's fine if you do. I want to today wanted to just bring your attention to some of the things that are going on because we know so much about DNA. Now we can say, all right, well, I can look at your DNA. I can look at your spouse's DNA. What are the chances that you would have a child with whatever? And I used to joke when I was dating, it was a total joke. I would never do it, but it was like this whole idea of, well, I know my DNA code. What does yours look like? Because if it doesn't look a certain way, right, we're not going to have kids because I only want certain, DNA alleles being passed on to my children, like smart and tall and whatever. So it's kind of a joke, but yet it's kind of true as well, because it's totally possible nowadays that we could look at two people. If, let's just say, you have a condition in your family that would lead to death, okay, genetic condition. We could look at your specific DNA code and your spouse's DNA code and say, are these two, if we put them together, would this gene that's lethal, okay, for an individual be present in your children? And then you can decide at that point whether you want to have kids or not, whether you want to risk it, whatever. And so I think there's just a lot of, once again, ethics involved in this topic. But I did want to bring it up just to give you an idea of how these things come about, since we did learn about protein synthesis and how all the proteins are formed from the DNA code, and then the problems that can occur from that. So cancer is obviously the big one. We have other diseases like breast cancer, Huntington's disease, dwarfism, lots of different varieties of things. And so hang out with Canvas. You're going to see an assignment in there on what I expect from you this week. You're going to do a little bit of research for me as your last formal assignment, and then we'll have some more direction for next week. So hope you guys are having a great semester. You're almost done, so hang in there. Loved your recording. Everything was great. Proud of you guys. Really excited to see all the awesome things that are happening at Urshan College. So wish I was a little bit closer to see you guys, but I'm definitely proud of you and excited for what your futures hold. So stay tuned for more things on genetic testing.